Picture this. It's October 1944, deep in the Vosges Mountains of northeastern France, where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. A group of young American soldiers trudges through freezing rain and mud. They're exhausted. They've been fighting for 8 straight days without rest. Many are wounded. All are cold, hungry, and pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance, and they're heading back into battle. But here's what makes this moment extraordinary. Here's what separates this story from every other tale of courage you've ever heard. These young men, these American soldiers marching toward almost certain death, are fighting for a country that has imprisoned their families. Their parents, their siblings, their wives and children are locked behind barbed wire in internment camps scattered across the American West, branded as potential traitors, stripped of their homes, their businesses, their dignity. These soldiers are Japanese Americans, second-generation immigrants born on American soil, raised with American values. They call themselves Nisei. And the motto they've chosen for their regiment speaks volumes about who they are and what they're willing to risk. Go for broke. It's a gambling term from Hawaii. It means risking everything, putting it all on the line, betting your last dollar on a single throw of the dice. And that's exactly what these men are doing. They're betting their lives that America will see them not as enemies, but as patriots. They're wagering everything on the hope that their sacrifice will prove their loyalty, will vindicate their families, will earn them the right to be called Americans without qualification or suspicion. They are the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and they are about to write one of the most heroic chapters in American military history. The story I'm about to tell you is true, every word of it, and it's a story that will challenge everything you think you know about courage, about loyalty, about what it means to love your country, even when your country doesn't seem to love you back. Before we dive into the heart of this incredible tale, let me set the stage, because to understand the 442nd, you need to understand the world that created them. Chapter 1. The Day Everything Changed. December 7th, 1941. It was a Sunday morning, a day that should have been peaceful. Families were getting ready for church. Couples were reading the newspapers over breakfast. Children were playing in their yards. Just an ordinary American Sunday, and then the world exploded. At 7:55 in the morning, 183 Japanese aircraft appeared over the Hawaiian island of Oahu. They came in waves, dropping bombs and firing machine guns at the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. When it was over, 2,400 Americans were gone. 18 ships were sunk or damaged. 350 aircraft destroyed. America was at war. But the shockwaves from Pearl Harbor didn't stop at the military. They rippled outward, crashing into every Japanese-American community across the nation. Suddenly, people who had lived in America for decades, who had never even set foot in Japan, who considered themselves Americans in every way that mattered, found themselves under suspicion. The fear was immediate and visceral. Neighbors who had lived next to Japanese-American families for years now looked at them differently. Business partners backed away. Friends became distant. The question hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Could they be trusted? Were they loyal to America or to the land of their ancestors? For the Nisei, it was a nightmare. These were people who had been born in America, who had grown up pledging allegiance to the flag every morning in school, who rooted for the Yankees and the Dodgers, who listened to Frank Sinatra on the radio and went to the movies on Saturday nights. They were Americans. But in the panicked aftermath of Pearl Harbor, that didn't seem to matter. The government moved quickly. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The document was bureaucratic, clinical, hiding its true meaning behind official language. But what it meant in practice was this. Anyone of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast would be removed from their homes and placed in internment camps. Think about that for a moment. Not convicted of any crime, not charged with anything, simply removed. Forced to leave their homes, their businesses, their entire lives behind because of their ethnicity. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans were affected. Most were citizens. Many had never even been to Japan. Some didn't even speak Japanese. But none of that mattered. They were given days, sometimes hours, to pack what they could carry. Everything else had to be left behind or sold for pennies on the dollar. Imagine being told you have 72 hours to pack up your entire life, your home, your business, everything you've worked for, and you can only take what you can carry in 2 suitcases. What do you take? Your photo albums? Your mother's jewelry? Your children's toys? How do you choose? Families reported to assembly points with their meager belongings. They were loaded onto buses and trains. Many had tags with numbers pinned to their clothes, like luggage. They traveled for hours, sometimes days, not knowing where they were going or what awaited them. What awaited them were camps, built in some of the most desolate places in America, the scorching deserts of Arizona and California, the freezing winters of Wyoming and Idaho, places where the wind howled and the dust storms made it hard to breathe. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences. Guard towers stood at the corners, manned by soldiers with rifles. The message was clear. You are not trusted. You are prisoners in your own country. The living conditions were harsh. Families were crammed into single rooms in wooden barracks with tar paper walls. There was no privacy, communal bathrooms, communal dining halls, long lines for everything. In the summer, the barracks were like ovens. In the winter, the thin walls did little to keep out the bitter cold. Young men, teenagers really, found themselves in an impossible position. They were Americans. They loved their country. Many had dreamed of serving in the military, of defending the nation they called home. But now that nation had turned on them, had locked up their families, had branded them as potential enemies. What would you do if your country imprisoned your family? Would you still fight for it? For many Nisei, the answer wasn't simple. Some were angry, some were disillusioned. Who could blame them? But others saw an opportunity, a chance to prove something, to show America who they really were, to earn through their blood, if necessary, the respect and recognition that should have been theirs by birth. Initially, the military wanted nothing to do with Japanese Americans. Young Nisei men were classified as 4C, enemy aliens, not fit for military service. It was an absurd classification for men who were American citizens, but in the hysteria of 1942, absurdity was the norm. But as the war dragged on, the military's needs grew. Soldiers were needed. And there were advocates, people who believed in the Nisei, who pushed for them to be given a chance. In Hawaii, where the Japanese-American population was much larger and hadn't been interned, a group called the Varsity Victory Volunteers had formed. These were students from the University of Hawaii, Nisei men who had been dismissed from the Reserve Officers Training Corps after Pearl Harbor. Rather than accept their dismissal, they volunteered to work as a labor battalion doing construction work for the military. They worked hard, proved their loyalty, made a name for themselves. Meanwhile, a battalion of Nisei soldiers from Hawaii, the 100th Infantry Battalion, was already in training. They were naturalized American citizens from the Hawaiian Islands. They'd been inducted into the military before Pearl Harbor. Now they were proving themselves to be exceptional soldiers. The success of the 100th gave the military an idea. What if they formed an entire regiment of Nisei soldiers, a segregated unit led by white officers but composed entirely of Japanese Americans? It would give the Nisei a chance to prove themselves, and it would provide the military with soldiers it desperately needed. On January 28, 1943, The War Department announced it would accept volunteers for a new segregated Nisei combat team. The goal was 1,500 volunteers from Hawaii and 3,000 from the mainland. The response in Hawaii was overwhelming. Young men lined up by the thousands. The military had to turn people away. In the end, over 10,000 Hawaiian Nisei volunteered. They represented families who had not been interned, who had been allowed to remain in their homes. For them, volunteering was an expression of patriotism, pure and simple. On the mainland, the response was more complicated. Here, the volunteers would be coming from behind barbed wire. They'd be leaving their families in the camps. The question was more painful. How can we fight for a country that's imprisoned us? Still, over 1,000 mainland Nisei volunteered. Some did it to prove their loyalty. Some did it out of a sense of duty. Some did it because they believed that their service might help their families, might lead to the camps being closed, might restore their rights as citizens. Each volunteer had to fill out a loyalty questionnaire. 2 questions in particular were controversial. Question 27 asked if they were willing to serve in combat duty wherever ordered. Question 28 asked if they would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor. Think about those questions. Imagine being locked in a camp, your rights stripped away, and being asked if you're loyal to the country that imprisoned you. For many, it felt like an insult. But for those who volunteered, the answer was yes. Yes to both questions. Yes, we will fight for you. Yes, we are loyal. Yes, we are American. In February 1943, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was officially activated. 4,000 men, most from Hawaii, some from the camps, gathered at Camp Shelby in Mississippi for training. Camp Shelby was in the Deep South. The Nisei soldiers, many of whom had never been outside Hawaii or California, found themselves in a world that was completely foreign to them. The heat, the humidity, the segregation. Mississippi in 1943 was a place where Jim Crow laws were in full effect, where whites-only signs hung over water fountains and restrooms, where Black Americans faced daily discrimination and violence. The Nisei soldiers found themselves in a strange position. They were not white, but they weren't classified as black either. They existed in a gray area, sometimes experiencing discrimination, sometimes witnessing the far worse discrimination faced by Black Americans. But they trained. They trained hard. For over a year, they drilled. They learned to work as a unit. The Hawaiian-born soldiers, who spoke Pidgin English and had a more casual attitude toward authority, clashed at first with the mainland soldiers, who were more formal, more reserved. There were fights. There was tension. But gradually, they came together. They realized they shared something fundamental. They were all Nisei. They were all Americans trying to prove themselves. They were all in this together. Their motto became their identity. Go for broke. Risk it all. Put everything on the line. It wasn't just bravado. It was a philosophy. They understood that they were fighting 2 wars, one against the Axis powers, another against racism and suspicion back home, and they couldn't afford to fight either war halfway. In April 1944, training was complete. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team shipped out to Europe. Destination: Italy. Chapter 2. Baptism by fire. The Mediterranean sun beat down on the transport ships as they approached the Italian coast. For many of the Nisei soldiers, it was their first time leaving American soil. They'd crossed an ocean, sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, and now they could see the coast of Italy, rising from the azure waters. Italy in June of 1944 was a country torn apart. The Allies had invaded from the south the previous year. They'd fought their way up the peninsula mile by bloody mile, facing fierce German resistance. The Germans had turned Italy into a fortress, building defensive lines across the narrowest points of the peninsula, forcing the Allies to pay in blood for every inch of ground. The 442nd disembarked at the port and moved inland. They were attached to the 34th Infantry Division. And on June 11, 1944, they received their first combat assignment. They would be joining the 100th Infantry Battalion. The 100th had been fighting in Italy since September of 1943. They'd seen heavy combat. They'd earned a fierce reputation. They'd also earned a nickname, the Purple Heart Battalion. Not because they'd been honored, but because so many of their soldiers had been wounded that they'd received thousands of Purple Heart medals. When the 442nd joined them, the 100th was officially absorbed into the regiment, but out of respect for their service, they were allowed to keep their original designation. So the combined unit became known as the 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Their first major operation was near the city of Suvereto. The objective seemed straightforward: capture a series of hills held by German forces. But nothing in war is straightforward. The Germans were dug in. They had machine gun nests positioned to cover every approach. They had mortars and artillery zeroed in on the likely attack routes. They had minefields to slow down any advance. And they had no intention of giving up ground without a fight. The attack began at dawn on June 26th. The Nice soldiers moved out, advancing up the rocky slopes under fire. The sound of machine guns cut through the air. Mortars exploded around them, sending shrapnel flying in all directions. Men fell. Others kept moving. This was their first taste of real combat. Training had prepared them for the mechanics of war, but nothing could prepare them for the reality, the fear, the chaos, the smell of cordite and blood, the screams of wounded men calling for medics. But they didn't break. They didn't retreat. They kept pushing forward. Private First Class Sadao Munamori was with them that day, a quiet young man from California. His family was in one of the camps. He'd volunteered anyway. He'd told his mother he was fighting for her, for all of them, to prove that Japanese Americans were loyal. As his squad advanced, they came under heavy machine gun fire. Men dove for cover. Munamori saw two of his buddies pinned down, unable to move without being cut down. Without hesitation, he charged the machine gun nest, throwing grenades. He took out the position, but as he did, a German grenade landed near his trapped comrades. Munamori threw himself on the grenade. The explosion took his life instantly. But his two buddies survived. Later, Munamori would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Nisei soldier to receive America's highest military decoration. His mother received the medal at the camp, where she was still imprisoned. The battle for the hills near Suvereto raged for days. The Nisei fought with ferocity and skill that surprised even their own officers. They captured their objectives. They proved they could fight. They proved they belonged. Over the next months, the 100th 442nd continued fighting their way up the Italian peninsula. They liberated towns. They broke through German defensive lines. They took casualties, heavy casualties, but they never faltered. The soldiers wrote letters home to their families in the camps. They couldn't talk about the specifics of their operations. The censors wouldn't allow it. But they wrote about their determination, about their hope, about their belief that what they were doing would make a difference. One soldier wrote to his parents, "We're fighting for you. Every German position we take, every mile we advance, it's for you, so that when we come home, we'll all be free." By the summer of 1944, the 442nd had earned a reputation. Other units wanted them as reinforcements. Generals specifically requested them for difficult assignments. They were proving to be some of the finest combat soldiers in the entire U.S. Army. But Italy was just the beginning. The mission that would define the 442nd, the battle that would cement their place in history, was waiting for them in France. Chapter 3. Into the Mountains of Hell. October 8, 1944. The ships carrying the 100th 442nd arrived at Marseille on the southern coast of France. The men disembarked expecting a brief rest, but rest was a luxury the military couldn't afford. They were immediately ordered north, their destination, the Vosges Mountains. If you've never heard of the Vosges, you're not alone. It's not a place that features prominently in most histories of World War II. But for the soldiers who fought there, it's a name that brings back memories of some of the worst combat of the entire war. The Vosges Mountains run along the eastern border of France, separating France from Germany. They're not particularly high by mountain standards, but they're covered in dense forests. Ancient forests where the trees grow so thick that even at midday the ground below is in twilight, where visibility is measured in feet, not yards, where every shadow could hide an enemy position. The Germans had turned the Vosges into a fortress. They'd had months to prepare their defenses. Hundreds of concrete pillboxes, miles of barbed wire, acres of minefields, machine gun positions carefully sighted to cover every approach. Artillery observers positioned on every high point, ready to call down devastating fire on anyone who tried to advance. And the weather was turning. October in the Vosges meant cold rain, thick fog, mud that sucked at your boots with every step, conditions that made fighting miserable and flying almost impossible, which meant no air support. The Nice soldiers arrived still wearing their summer uniforms from Italy. They weren't prepared for the cold. Many didn't even have proper cold weather gear, but there was no time to wait. The offensive was already underway. The 442nd was attached to the 36th Infantry Division, a unit that included many soldiers from Texas. They were given their first objective: liberate two small towns, Bruyères and Bifontaine. On paper, it didn't sound too difficult. Bruyères was a town of maybe 4,000 people, nestled in a valley surrounded by 4 hills. Bifontaine was even smaller, just a hamlet, really. How hard could it be? The answer, very hard. Bruyères had been occupied by the Germans for over 4 years. The 4 hills surrounding it were key to its defense, and the Germans held all of them. To take the town, the Nice would have to take the hills first, and every one of those hills was fortified. The attack began on October 15th. The plan was to take the hills one by one, then move into the town itself. Simple in theory, hell in practice. The slopes were steep, the trees were so thick you could barely see 10 feet ahead. Every step could trigger a mine, every shadow could conceal a machine gun nest, and the Germans, fighting on familiar ground, knew exactly where to position their forces for maximum effect. The Nice advanced uphill under fire. Machine guns raked their lines. Mortars exploded among the trees, sending deadly shrapnel flying. Men fell. Medics rushed forward to help the wounded, exposing themselves to enemy fire. Officers shouted orders. Soldiers returned fire, but often they couldn't even see what they were shooting at. This wasn't the open warfare of the Italian campaign. This was close-quarters combat in thick forests. Sometimes the fighting was hand-to-hand. Sometimes you didn't know if the soldier 10 feet away in the fog was friend or foe until it was too late. It took 3 days of brutal fighting to secure the first hill. 3 days. Hundreds of casualties, but they took it. Then they moved to the second hill. More fighting, more casualties, more ground won at terrible cost. By October 18th, they had all 4 hills. The way to Bruyères was open. The Nice soldiers, exhausted and depleted, moved into the town. The Germans had withdrawn, but they'd left behind booby traps, buildings rigged to explode, roads seeded with mines. Even in retreat, they were dangerous. The people of Bruyères emerged from their cellars where they'd sheltered during the fighting. They saw American soldiers, but these weren't the white American soldiers they'd expected. These were Asian faces. Some of the French civilians were confused at first, but confusion quickly turned to gratitude. These soldiers, whoever they were, had liberated them, and the people of Bruyères would never forget it. But there was no time for celebration. The Nice had their next objective, Bifontaine. If Bruyères was difficult, Bifontaine was worse. It was a tiny hamlet deep in the forest, of no particular strategic value. The officers of the 100th Battalion thought the order to take it was questionable. Why risk lives for a place that didn't matter? But orders were orders. And Major General John Dahlquist, commander of the 36th Division, wanted Biffontaine taken. The 100th Battalion entered Biffontaine on October 22nd. They found it defended by a small German force, which they quickly drove out. They occupied the town, set up defensive positions in the buildings, and prepared for what they knew would come next, a German counterattack. It came that night. German forces, supported by tanks and anti-aircraft guns used in a direct fire role, pounded the tiny town. The Nice soldiers, holed up in cellars and ruined buildings, returned fire, but they were cut off. The Germans had sealed the roads behind them. No supplies could get through. No reinforcements could reach them. For 2 days, the 100th held Biffontaine. They fought off repeated attacks. They were running low on ammunition, running low on food, running low on everything. The Germans called out to them in the darkness, telling them to surrender, that they were surrounded, that there was no hope. The Nice didn't surrender. They held their ground. And on October 24th, reinforcements from the rest of the 442nd broke through and relieved them. Biffontaine was secure, but the cost had been terrible. Many of the most experienced officers and enlisted men of the 100th were gone, wounded or worse. The battalion had been through hell. The entire regiment had been through hell. They'd been in continuous combat for over a week. They'd liberated 2 towns. They'd accomplished every objective given to them. They were exhausted. They'd taken heavy casualties. They needed rest. They deserved rest. On October 24th, they were finally given that rest. They were pulled back to a rear area, a village called Belmont. They could sleep. They could eat hot food. They could write letters home. They could mourn their friends who hadn't made it. They thought they'd have several days to recover. They thought they'd earned it. They had barely a day and a half. Because deep in the Vosges forest, another American unit was in desperate trouble, and the 442nd was about to be called on for the most dangerous mission of their lives. Chapter 4. The Lost Battalion. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment was in trouble, deep trouble. These were soldiers from Texas, part of the 36th Division, good men, experienced soldiers, but they'd been given an order that their own officers thought was unwise, and now they were paying the price for it. On October 24th, the same day the 442nd was being pulled back for rest, the 1st 141st had been ordered to advance deep into the Vosges forest. Their mission was to march beyond the nearest Allied positions and seize 2 hills that the Germans held. The officers of the 141st had expressed concerns. They'd be advancing without support on their flanks. They'd be beyond the range of most of their artillery. If something went wrong, if the Germans counterattacked, they'd be isolated. But Major General Dahlquist, their commanding officer, insisted. The 36th Division was making progress. They needed to keep pushing. The 141st would advance. So they did. 275 men marched into the forest on what would become a nightmare. At first, everything seemed fine. They advanced about 4 miles, meeting only light resistance. The Germans seemed to be withdrawing. They reached their objectives and began to dig in, but it was a trap. The Germans had let them pass through deliberately. Once the Texans were deep in the forest, isolated and exposed, the German forces closed in behind them. They cut the roads. They set up roadblocks. They laid mines. They positioned machine guns to cover every possible route in or out. The 1st 141st was surrounded, completely cut off from the rest of the 36th Division. No supplies could reach them. No reinforcements could get through. They were on their own, and the Germans knew exactly where they were. The weather turned even worse. Cold rain fell constantly. Fog reduced visibility to almost nothing. The Texans dug foxholes in the muddy ground and waited. They tried to conserve their ammunition. They rationed their food. They treated their wounded as best they could with limited medical supplies. The Germans probed their perimeter constantly. Not a full assault, just enough to keep the Americans pinned down, to wear them out, to make them use up their precious ammunition. On October 25th, the trapped soldiers tried to send out a patrol to break through and reach American lines. 36 men volunteered. Only 5 made it back. The rest were either captured or worse. By this time, the rest of the 36th Division knew the 1st 141st was in trouble. The question was, what could be done about it? The 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 141st tried to break through. They attacked the German positions blocking the way to their trapped comrades. They fought hard. They took casualties, but they couldn't break through. The German defenses were too strong. The situation was becoming desperate. The trapped soldiers were running out of everything: food, water, medical supplies, ammunition. Men were dying. Others were wounded and couldn't be evacuated. The cold and wet were taking a toll. Some men were developing trench foot, their feet literally rotting in their boots from the constant moisture. The Air Force tried to help. Fighter planes flew over the trapped position and attempted to drop supplies. But the forest was so thick and the target area so small that most of the supplies missed. Some landed right in the German positions. The Germans got American rations and ammunition, while the trapped soldiers got nothing. Time was running out. If something wasn't done soon, all 275 men would be lost. General Dahlquist made a decision. He called back the 442nd. It was the early morning hours of October the 25th. The Nice soldiers of the 442nd had been resting for barely 36 hours. Many were sleeping for the first time in over a week. They were exhausted. They were depleted. They'd lost many of their best men in the fighting for Bruyères and Bifontaine. But they were ordered back into action. Their mission: break through the German lines and rescue the lost battalion. That's what the press was calling the trapped 1st 141st, the Lost Battalion. It was a dramatic name, evocative of a similar situation from World War I. But for the soldiers involved, there was nothing romantic about it. They were trapped, they were surrounded, and they were dying. The Nice soldiers knew what was being asked of them. This wasn't going to be easy. 2 battalions had already tried and failed. The Germans were dug in strong positions, and they knew the Americans would try again. They'd be waiting, ready. It was a suicide mission, really. Everyone knew it. The question was whether enough of them would survive to reach the trapped Texans before it was too late. As the Nice soldiers gathered their gear and prepared to move out, some of them wrote quick letters home, just in case. One soldier wrote to his family in the camp, "We've been asked to do something important, something that will save American lives. If I don't make it back, know that I was proud to serve, proud to be an American." They moved out in the pre-dawn darkness, marching back toward the same forest they'd just left, back toward the killing ground. Chapter 5. 5 Days in Hell, October 26, 1944. The 100th and 2nd Battalions of the 442nd moved into position at the edge of the forest. The 3rd Battalion would support them. The entire regimental combat team, with its artillery, engineers, and support units, was being thrown into this mission. The plan was to attack from a different direction than the previous attempts. Instead of a frontal assault, they'd try to outflank the German positions. It was still going to be a hard fight, but it gave them a better chance. The forest they were entering was called the Forêt domaniale de Champs, ancient woods, dense undergrowth, steep ravines. Everything was wet from the constant rain. Visibility was terrible, and somewhere in that forest were hundreds, maybe thousands, of German soldiers waiting for them. The attack began in the afternoon. The Nice soldiers advanced into the forest, moving carefully, watching for mines, watching for ambushes. The Germans let them get deep into the woods. Then the shooting started. Machine gun fire erupted from positions the scouts hadn't spotted. Mortars began falling. Artillery exploded among the trees, sending fragments of wood and metal flying like deadly shrapnel. Men hit the ground. Officers shouted orders. Squads maneuvered to flank the enemy positions. This was what the 100th 442nd had been trained for. They worked as a team. While one squad laid down suppressing fire, another would maneuver around the flank. Combat engineers moved forward to clear mines. Artillery observers called in fire on German positions, but progress was measured in yards, sometimes feet. Every position they took cost blood, and as soon as they took one position, they'd come under fire from the next. Private First Class George Sakato was there that day. Years later, he'd describe it like this. The lines were so close that when our own artillery was firing, we'd jump into any hole we could find to avoid getting hit by our own shells. You didn't care if there was a German in the hole with you. You just jumped in. Night fell, but the fighting continued. In the darkness, it was even more confusing. You couldn't see more than a few feet. Friend and foe were hard to distinguish. There were moments of pure terror when a sound in the darkness could be anything: a German patrol, a wounded comrade, a wild animal startled by the gunfire. The Nisei soldiers dug in where they were and tried to get some rest. But true rest was impossible. It was too cold, too wet. The possibility of a German counterattack kept everyone on edge. Day 2. October 27th. The attack continued at dawn. The Nisei pushed forward again. More machine gun nests, more mortar fire, more casualties. The medics worked frantically, moving from one wounded man to another, often under fire themselves. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama was one of those medics. When soldiers were hit, he'd race forward to treat them, bullets zinging past his head. He'd patch them up as best he could, sometimes under direct fire, then help carry them back to safety. He saved countless lives over those 5 days. He'd survived the war and later become a doctor. But not all the medics were so lucky. 13 medics from the 442nd would be lost during the rescue mission, men who ran toward danger instead of away from it, men who died trying to save others. By the end of the second day, the 442nd had advanced maybe a mile. Maybe. They'd taken heavy casualties, but they were still pushing forward, still fighting toward the trapped battalion. Meanwhile, in the trapped perimeter, the Texans could hear the fighting in the distance. They knew someone was trying to reach them. The sound of American machine guns, American artillery, gave them hope. Someone was coming. They just had to hold on. Day 3. October 28th. The pattern was the same. Advance at dawn, fight for every yard, take casualties, dig in at night. The exhaustion was overwhelming. Men were operating on pure willpower. Some were wounded but refused to be evacuated, staying with their units because they knew every man counted. Staff Sergeant Barney Hajiro distinguished himself repeatedly during these days. When his platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire, he'd charge the positions alone, throwing grenades, firing his rifle, knocking out gun after gun. He was wounded multiple times, but kept fighting. He'd later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions, though not until the year 2000, 55 years after the war ended, because of discrimination in how medals were awarded. The Germans fought ferociously. They knew what the Americans were trying to do, and they were determined to stop them. They called in their own artillery. They brought up reinforcements. They weren't going to let the Americans break through if they could help it. But the Nisei kept coming, company after company, battalion after battalion. When one unit was too depleted to continue, another would take over. It was a relay race where the baton was made of blood and the finish line was 4 miles away through hell. Day 4. October 29th. The intensity of the fighting reached a crescendo. The Nisei were getting close now, close enough that the trapped Texans could hear individual firefights, not just the distant rumble of battle. But the casualties for the 442nd were mounting to catastrophic levels. Company I of the 3rd Battalion had entered the forest with 185 men. By now, only 8 were still unwounded, 8 out of 185. Company K had started with 186 men. 17 were still unhurt. 17. The losses were staggering, but they were so close now, so close to breaking through, they couldn't stop, not when they were this close. The Germans seemed to sense that the breakthrough was coming. They intensified their fire. Artillery pounded the American positions. The forest itself seemed to be exploding. Private First Class Joe Hayashi was advancing with his squad when a German shell exploded nearby. Shrapnel tore through his body. He fell. His squad mates rushed to help him, but he waved them off. "Keep going," he said. "Don't stop for me. Get to those boys. Save them." He died there in the forest, one of hundreds of Nisei soldiers who would not see the mission completed. Day 5, October 30th. The Nisei woke before dawn. This was it. Today they would reach the trapped battalion. Today they would complete the mission, or they would die trying. The final push began. The 2nd Battalion, what was left of it, advanced through a killing ground of interlocking machine gun fire. Men fell, others kept moving. There was no thought of stopping, no thought of failure. They were too close. Around noon, soldiers of the 2nd Battalion broke through the last German defensive line. They could see American soldiers ahead, soldiers in American uniforms, dirty and exhausted and wounded, but alive. Technical Sergeant Mutt Sakamoto was one of the first to reach them. He approached a group of soldiers huddled in a foxhole. They looked at him with disbelief, an Asian face. Was this a trick? Were these Japanese soldiers? Sakamoto pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered them to the trapped soldiers. "Cigarette?" he said. One of the Texans, a soldier named Ed Guy, started crying. "I might have hugged him," Guy would say years later. "I was just so glad we were getting out of there." 211 men. That's how many of the original 275 survived. 211 soldiers saved. The cost for the 442nd, over 800 casualties. More than 800 Nisei soldiers wounded or lost in 5 days of fighting. They'd suffered more casualties than the number of men they'd rescued. Think about that. They took more casualties than the number of people they saved. Why? Why would they do that? Why would they risk so much for soldiers they didn't even know? Because it was the right thing to do. Because those were American soldiers in trouble, and the Nisei were American soldiers who could help. It was that simple and that complicated. Because maybe, just maybe, if they proved their courage, if they proved their loyalty beyond any possible doubt, America would finally see them as they saw themselves, as Americans, period, no qualifications, no asterisks. Chapter 6, The Review That Changed Everything, November 12, 1944. 2 weeks after the rescue of the lost battalion, the 100th 442nd was finally granted a real rest. They were pulled out of the line, given time to recover, time to process what they'd been through. They'd been in almost continuous combat for over 3 weeks. The Vosges campaign had cost them dearly. Of the nearly 3,000 men who had entered the forest at the beginning of October, 161 were gone. 43 were missing. Nearly 2,000 were wounded. The regiment had been reduced to less than a third of its strength. But General Dahlquist wanted to see them. He ordered a full review of the regiment, a formal ceremony where he would thank them for their service, recognize their sacrifice, honor their courage. The survivors assembled in formation in the town of Bruyères, one of the towns they'd liberated. They stood in their ranks, these young men who had been through hell and come out the other side. General Dahlquist arrived. He looked at the formation. Something seemed wrong. Where were all the men? He turned to the officers. "Where's the regiment? I ordered a full review." There was a long silence. Finally, one officer spoke up. "This is the regiment, sir." "What do you mean, this is the regiment? Where are the rest of the men?" "This is all that's left, sir." The general was stunned. He'd known they'd taken casualties, but seeing the reality, seeing how few men remained, hit him like a physical blow. One account says that some of the surviving soldiers, angry at Dahlquist for the losses they'd suffered, for the missions they'd been sent on, refused to look at him. They stared straight ahead, their faces like stone. The ceremony was brief, awkward. What could be said? How do you thank men for sacrificing so much? How do you acknowledge that kind of loss? After the war, many of the Nisei soldiers would express anger about how they'd been used, about being sent on missions that seemed to cost more than they were worth, about a general who seemed to spend their lives without sufficient care. But they'd done their duty. They'd accomplished every mission. They'd proved what they'd set out to prove. News of the lost battalion rescue made headlines across America. The story of Japanese-American soldiers saving trapped Texans captured the public imagination. Here was proof, dramatic and undeniable, that the Nisei were loyal Americans, that they were heroes. But for the families still in the camps, the news was bittersweet. They were proud of their sons, their brothers, their husbands. But they were also grieving. So many had been lost. So many wounded. And for what? The families were still behind barbed wire. The 442nd continued fighting through the winter and into the spring of 1945. They were sent to the Maritime Alps to guard the French-Italian border. Then, in March, they were sent back to northern Italy for the final Allied offensive. They fought in the Po Valley. They helped break through the Gothic Line, the last major German defensive position in Italy. They were there when the Germans finally surrendered in Italy on May 2, 1945. Throughout all of it, they maintained their reputation for courage and effectiveness. By the war's end, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had become the most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service. 21 Medals of Honor, though it should be noted that only one was awarded during the war. The other 20 were upgraded from lesser medals in the year 2000, after a review determined that discrimination had prevented deserving Nisei soldiers from receiving proper recognition at the time. 9,486 Purple Hearts, nearly 4,000 Bronze Stars, 560 Silver Stars, 8 Presidential Unit citations, an unprecedented number of awards and decorations. Approximately 18,000 men served in the 442nd over the course of the war. The original 4,000 had to be replaced 2.5 times due to casualties. Think about what that means. The unit took so many casualties that they had to bring in replacements for replacements. And through it all, not a single Nisei soldier was ever charged with desertion or treason. Not one. Perfect loyalty. Perfect service. Chapter 7. Coming Home to Barbed Wire. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the men of the 442nd thought their ordeal was over. They'd fought, they'd bled, they'd proven their loyalty beyond any possible doubt. Surely now they'd be welcomed home as heroes. Surely now their families would be freed. But America in 1945 was not yet ready to fully embrace its Japanese-American citizens. Many of the Nisei soldiers returned home to find their families still in the camps. The camps wouldn't begin to close until late 1945 and into 1946. And when families were finally released, they had nowhere to go. Their homes had been sold, their businesses taken over by others, their possessions lost or stolen. Some families tried to return to their old neighborhoods and found they weren't welcome. Signs in shop windows read, "No Japs allowed." Some families found their homes vandalized, their property destroyed. In some cases, there was violence. The veterans themselves faced discrimination. Despite their service, despite their medals, many found it hard to get jobs. "We don't hire Japs," they were told. Veterans organizations like the VFW and American Legion initially refused to allow Nisei veterans to join existing posts. Some posts even removed Japanese-American soldiers from their honor rolls, It was a bitter homecoming for men who had given so much. But there were also moments of recognition. On July 15, 1946, the 442nd Regiment marched down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman was there to honor them. Truman pinned the Presidential Unit Citation banner to the regiment's colors. Then he made a speech. "You fought not only the enemy," Truman said, "but you fought prejudice, and you have won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win, to make this great republic stand for just what the Constitution says it stands for, the welfare of all the people, all the time." It was a powerful moment. Recognition from the President of the United States himself. But words, however sincere, couldn't make up for what had been lost, couldn't restore the homes and businesses, couldn't bring back the soldiers who hadn't made it home. Slowly, gradually, things began to change. The story of the 442nd became better known. Their courage in the face of discrimination became a source of inspiration. The Texans they'd rescued never forgot what the Nisei had done for them. In 1962, Texas Governor John Connally made all veterans of the 442nd Honorary Texans in recognition of their sacrifice in saving the lost battalion. It was a symbolic gesture, but a meaningful one. In 2010, Congress passed a law awarding the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States, to the members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Military Intelligence Service. The ceremony was held in the Capitol building in October 2011. By then, most of the veterans were in their 80s or 90s. Many couldn't make the trip to Washington. Local ceremonies were held in California, Hawaii, and other states where the veterans lived. One veteran, asked what the recognition meant to him after all those years, said, "It's good to finally be recognized, but we didn't do it for medals. We did it because we were Americans, and it was our duty. We just wanted the chance to prove it." Chapter 8. Legacy of the Go for Broke Regiment. Today, if you visit the town of Bruyères in France, you'll find monuments to the 442nd, streets named after Nisei soldiers, memorials honoring their sacrifice. The people of Bruyères haven't forgotten who liberated them in October 1944. Every year, elderly French citizens place flowers at these monuments. Some are people who were children during the war, who remember the Asian-faced American soldiers who freed their town. They remember the kindness the soldiers showed to civilians, the chocolate bars shared with hungry children, the care taken to minimize damage to the town. Similar monuments exist in Bifontaine and other French towns liberated by the 442nd. The gratitude of the French people endures. In Hawaii, the 442nd is a source of immense pride. Many families in Hawaii had sons who served in the regiment. Their service helped pave the way for Hawaii's eventual statehood in 1959. Daniel Inouye, who served with the 442nd in Italy and lost his right arm in combat, went on to become a United States Senator from Hawaii. He served in the Senate for nearly 50 years, becoming one of the most respected members of that body. He carried the legacy of the 442nd with him throughout his political career, often speaking about the importance of civil rights and the dangers of discrimination. The story of the 442nd has been told in books, documentaries, and films. The 1951 film Go for Broke, starring Van Johnson, helped bring their story to a wider audience, though it was made at a time when Hollywood still struggled with authentic representation. More recent documentaries have told the story with greater depth and nuance, interviewing surviving veterans and their families, exploring not just the battles, but the context of discrimination that made the regiment's service so remarkable. In military academies, the 442nd is studied as an example of unit cohesion, courage under fire, and effective small unit tactics. Their combat record speaks for itself. But perhaps more importantly, Their story serves as a powerful reminder about the dangers of prejudice and the strength of the human spirit. These were men who had every reason to be bitter, every reason to turn their backs on a country that had turned its back on them. But they didn't. They chose loyalty over bitterness. They chose service over resentment. They chose to prove their love for America even when America doubted them. That choice wasn't easy. Many struggled with it. Some never fully reconciled their feelings about what was done to them and their families. The internment camps left scars that lasted a lifetime, but their service, their sacrifice, their willingness to give everything for a nation that had wronged them stands as one of the most profound acts of patriotism in American history. Conclusion: what go for broke really means. In 1988, more than 40 years after the war ended, the United States government formally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which acknowledged that the internment was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The government offered reparations to surviving internees, $20,000 per person. It wasn't enough. How do you put a price on lost homes, lost businesses, lost years? But it was an acknowledgment, an admission of wrong. Many of the 442nd veterans were present for the signing. Some wept. Some remained stone-faced. All felt that finally, their government had acknowledged the injustice done to them and their families. But the veterans would tell you that they didn't fight for an apology. They didn't fight for reparations. They fought because they were Americans, and America was in danger. They fought because when your country calls, you answer, even if your country has wronged you. Go for broke meant risking everything, but it meant more than that. It meant believing in an ideal even when the reality fell short. It meant having faith in what America could be, even when confronted with what America was. The Nisei soldiers of the 442nd bet everything on that ideal. They bet their lives on the hope that America would eventually live up to its own principles, that all men are created equal would someday include them. It was a bet they won, though the price was high. Today, when you see an Asian American in uniform, when you see any American of any background serving their country, you're seeing the legacy of the 442nd. They helped prove that patriotism has no racial boundaries, that courage comes in all colors. That American identity is not about where your ancestors came from, but about the values you hold and the sacrifices you're willing to make. The story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team is not just a war story, it's an American story. A story about the gap between American ideals and American reality, and about the people who risked everything to close that gap. It's a story about young men who went into the forests of France and the mountains of Italy and bled for a country that had imprisoned their families, who took casualties to save soldiers they'd never met, who proved their loyalty in the most final way possible. It's a story that should be taught in every school, that should be remembered by every generation, because it's a story that speaks to the best of what America can be, even as it acknowledges the worst of what America has sometimes been. The veterans are leaving us now. The youngest would be in their 90s. Soon there will be no more first-hand voices to tell this story. But the story itself will endure, because go for broke isn't just a motto from World War II. It's a philosophy, a way of approaching life. When the odds are against you, when people doubt you, when you have every reason to quit, you go for broke. You put everything on the line. You risk it all for what you believe in. The men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team did exactly that. They went for broke. And in doing so, they didn't just win battles. They didn't just save lives. They didn't just earn medals. They helped redefine what it means to be an American. That's a legacy worth remembering, a story worth telling, a sacrifice worth honoring. Go for broke indeed.